And then we're going to, I'm going to start the webinar so that you could allow people to start coming in.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes until everyone's able to get into the room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, good afternoon to those who are still joining. Just a couple more minutes and we'll go ahead and get this webinar started. All right, looks like we have a few more still logging on. We'll wait about 30 more seconds. All right, thank you all for joining. I think we'll go ahead and get started today. Good afternoon, my name is Jamie Vandermolen and I lead sustainability initiatives for Nutrient. This is the first of many in a series of webinars that Nutrient is launching this year to explore the economics, the incentives, and the programs behind environmental solutions. So we'll cover topics from solar to technology solutions to renewable natural gas partnerships, which is what we're here to talk about today. So we launched this webinar kind of out of a need that we saw. More and more projects are coming online or underway in the US today, and the opportunities seem really ripe for farms, but it can be a really hard space to navigate. It's kind of challenging to keep tabs on the dozens of new developers that are entering the space, the multiple ways to kind of structure your contracts that work best for your farm. And most importantly, just understand how do you help prepare your farm for different conversations that may come your way from an RNG developer. So the webinar today is focused on just that. And we're going to cover some questions that we've received in the past, and through phone calls from farms and other, but what incentives are driving activity in the space today? What is the current farm related information I should know before discussions with developers? So how do you better understand the cost of your manure management, which is a really key important thing to understand. And Mark Storman will talk more about that today, one of our speakers. What type of expertise and resources should I consider? John Larson, who's gone through projects like this, has a really good understanding of what type of expertise he used from the beginning until the project launched. So he's going to talk more about that. And kind of what questions should I ask an RNG developer? At the very end, we'll go through a list of questions that's super essential to ask in these conversations. I'm going to give a big shout out before we get started to our sponsor, American Biogas Council. ABC, or American Biogas Council, has been working in this space for many, many years. And is the only national trade association that represents the entire US biogas industry. They're committed to maximizing production of biogas, and they're really important partners in this effort. So you will hear more from Patrick, who's here today as a speaker. He's the executive director at ABC. In addition, I think I mentioned our other speakers. We'll hear from Patrick at ABC. We have Brad Plima from Eco Engineers, who's going to review some of the current financial incentives that exist in the future markets. John Larson, we're going to do a kind of Q&A, ask him anything with him to better learn about the project that he just broke ground on 6 months ago and some of the learnings he had. And then Mark Storman from Nutrient is going to walk through some step-by-step considerations that each farm should consider, from crunching numbers to asking the right questions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Patrick Surface from American Biogas Council.
Great. Thanks you so much, Jamie. And a huge thanks to Mark and the rest of the Nutrient team for pulling this all together and giving us the chance to be able to talk to all of you. The agriculture industry is so important to the American Biogas Council. And recently, while we really are interested in many parts of the agriculture sector, mostly dairy, swine, some beef cattle, some poultry, the dairy industry has really become especially important recently, and that's part of what we're going to be getting into today. So next slide. One of the things that's really happened here, we've got probably about 260 farm-based operating biogas system out of about 2,000 operational ones across the country. And you're hearing a lot more about the ones on farms. For a big reason is because of the policies that are in place that really incentivize projects to be based on farms. Not only there, but certainly there's a big opportunity. So we're seeing projects like the one on the left here, where we've got farms taking their manure, turning it into biogas, using it to make electricity to go to BMW electric vehicles. We've got Dominion working with Vanguard Renewables up in the Northeast and elsewhere around the country on dairy to RNG projects. And then we've got, California-based projects as well. You're seeing examples all over the place. I hope you'll take the time to kind of hear some of these stories and listen, talk to some of your fellow farmers on what they're doing here, because there is a lot that is changing. It's still the same technology, it's still the same bugs, but I think the industry has become a lot more mature and making all of this work a lot better for everyone, make the systems work well together. Next slide. So here's what we're talking about at a very, very basic level. So we're talking about taking organic material. If you look at the very center part of this, that's the heart of your biogas system. That's your digester. And some of you may roll your eyes at this. We like to use the example of a digester being a lot like a cow's stomach. You're basically trying to create a nice warm environment where the microbes that are already present in the organic material are going to reproduce, eat up the organic material, and burp out methane. And that methane is the energy, and that's what is generally most of the revenue generation for your project. So the input material could be, it's usually manure as your base, but it could also be other organic material from the crops or other even processing, even from the dairy processors. Generally, it's non-woody organic material going into the digester. And then coming out, you've got biogas, and then you've got your solids and liquids. And your solids and liquids are usually going to be used as a soil amendment of some kind, especially the liquids, because liquids are heavy is expensive to move. You might dry your solids and use them for bedding and help reduce a cost there. But your solids and liquids you're going to try to use as locally as you possibly can. And then your gas, your biogas, that's where you're going to try to find another market for it and either work on that yourself or work with an industry partner to help do that. And usually you're going to be using some of the biogas. You'd make one of two choices, either go to RNG or go to electricity. You might use some of it for heat on site. You should certainly do that if you want to. But if you go to RNG, that basically means taking out everything that's not methane out of the gas, which is basically carbon dioxide. So you've got pure methane, and then at that point, it's the same as conventional natural gas. It's completely interchangeable, and you can sell that to vehicles that use natural gas, UPS trucks, buses, CNG vehicles, et cetera. And you're probably going to sell that into a market that is not near your farm. You're going to move that gas by pipeline somewhere else to sell it. Or you're going to make electricity. And of course, electricity is easier to transport through our electric grid. So you might make electricity with an engine, a microturbine, or a fuel cell on your farm, most likely, and then transport that electricity offsite. And because of a lot of the programs that we have, you're probably going to want to try to get that electricity to go to electric vehicles. Next slide. And so this is my last one here. This is an AgStar slide from EPA. And one of the key things to point out here is that the data only go up to 2019 here, and you're starting to see a little uptick on these bottom two charts. So this chart shows the all the farm-based systems in the US and what they're using their biogas for. So the most common, the top line there, is combined heat and power. So that's electricity and heat. And the ones that you're going to hear the most about are the bottom two, the green and the blue, which there hasn't been very much of over time, but it's starting to get an uptick. And my assumption is that if this line went up to 2021, you would see it jumping up much, much, much higher. Just a couple of years ago, we had about 30 projects going to RNG. We now have like 130. This is growing really quickly. And the opportunity for you is basically to try to generate credits that are worth way more than the biogas that you're actually producing. You want to generate those credits and sell them. And you can either do that, you're generally going to sell those credits with one of two programs that are both vehicle related. And the one that's most lucrative right now, the LCFS, which you see down there at the bottom, is going to incentivize you. It's going to give you more credits if you can reduce the carbon footprint of the entire fuel production. So that includes your farm. It also includes how the fuel is actually used. The more carbon intensity can come down, the more credits you generate, the more money you can make. And so you're going to see that not only are we talking about renewable energy, we also end up talking about manure management practices and things like that. So we're really, we want to see more biogas projects built. That's what the American Biogas Council is all about. We represent about 250 companies, including farms around the country. We'd love to help support you if you want to work with us directly. So please reach out to us and look into us. AmericanBiogasCouncil.org, and I will turn it back to Jamie, and you'll get to hear from the real experts. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Patrick. And that was very helpful and great work you're doing in this space. Before we transition, I saw the Q&A box linking a little bit. Wanted to remind everyone on the call, we really encourage you, as you know, we move through these presentations, to type your questions into the chat box. We're saving ample time at the end to get to some of those questions. And if we don't get to them today, we will do written follow-ups in a follow-up email. So please feel free to type those questions in as we move through them today. I'm now going to transition to Brad Plima from Eco Engineers. So he leads the renewable natural gas line of business at Eco Engineers. He's consulted and helped more than 1.5 billion in clean energy investments, primarily in this RNG sector. He's super knowledgeable in water, wastewater, renewable energy, and project work. He has a great read on the size of the opportunities, the programs, and the incentives that are driving these RNG projects today, like the LCFS that Patrick just mentioned. So really want you to take away here that the manure on your farm and the benefits you provide have immense value in this project partnership. And he's going to help kind of break down where that value might be.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Brad Plima, a senior engineer. I lead our renewable natural gas line of business at Eco Engineers. And just quickly, why are we here? What does Eco Engineers do in this space? We do three things. We're consultants, independent consultants, auditors, and we do a lot of compliance management work. And what we found in successful clean energy projects, not just RNG, but any clean energy project, is anyone that invests in these 6 areas will likely have a successful project. So our business is really set up around these areas. Won't go through each one, but we do a lot of training and education, regulatory engagement. A big one that we do is the life cycle analysis. So the carbon intensity, that carbon footprint that Patrick mentioned, that is very important for these dairy opportunities. We're ones that will do that preliminary or final CI, carbon intensity assessment. We help support the design and the construction, really setting these things up to generate all of the credits that we're going to talk about today. And then when the projects are operational, we can register them into the various programs and do ongoing audit. So we've worked with about 200 renewable fuel production facilities over the last few years. Probably about 125 of those are RNG projects. And we've helped and done that life cycle assessment or consulted with about 125 dairy farms. So we're very ingrained and embedded into this dairy industry. I'll go ahead. Next slide, please. So just quickly, what are the options for RNG? We're going to focus, not going to go through all of these, but we're going to focus on the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, or RINs, if you're familiar with that, and the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and LCFS credits. So the reason we're going to focus on both those programs really reward projects like dairy manure to RNG. There's really high values from both of these programs that you can stack together and use in order to generate revenues to offset the costs needed to build the digester and to put some of the other systems in place. But wanted to show these aren't the only two markets. They're the most lucrative right now. And so a vast majority of dairy RNG projects are targeting the California LCFS and the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard. But there's many other places to sell renewable natural gas, biogas, renewable electricity into. Next slide, please. So the RFS, the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, you've probably heard RINs. What are those? What is this program, and how are dairy manure projects and RNG take advantage of this program? So it's a program that's been established and in place since 2007. It really got going in 2009 under really a driver of ethanol early on in the program. And then in 2014, the EPA opened up these incentives for biogas and renewable natural gas, and manure being one of the approved feedstocks under this program. So the goal of it is to produce renewable fuel. And Patrick mentioned several times the need to use this as transportation fuel. So in this program, in order to qualify, in order to generate RINs, the end use needs to be transportation fuel. It does not need to be on-site use, though. You can actually inject this into a pipeline system and have a virtual offtake agreement, or displace fossil gas in California, or really any state in the United States, to take advantage of this program. And the goal really is to incentivize the development of biofuels, and the target of 36 billion gallons of renewable fuel by 2022. We're not going to make that number. We're probably closer to about 21 billion here in 2021. So there's still significant growth potential within the program. And it is a core program that is used to generate RINs from dairy manure to RNG projects. Next slide, please. Another big program is the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and it's really the driver of probably 75% of the economics around these dairy manure RNG projects. Very similar in its setup, where the goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and lower the use of petroleum and fossil-based fuels, specifically within the state of California. And because this program is state-specific, the federal RFS is federal and country specific, or broad, then you can actually generate credits from both programs if you use this dairy RNG as a transportation fuel within the state of California. So the goal is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions specifically from transportation fuel by 20% by 2030. And the goal is to incentivize the development of low carbon fuels as transportation fuel across many different sectors. And the big thing here is that I wanted to point out is the carbon intensity score, the CI score, is all talked about within these dairy RNG projects, because the more efficient and the lower your carbon intensity score is, the more credits and the more revenue you'll generate under this California program. So the difference between this and the RFS, the federal RFS, is that is a volume-based program. There is no efficiency, or there's no carbon intensity component to that program, where the California market rewards programs or rewards projects that have a better and a lower carbon intensity score. And we'll show why that's important here shortly. Next slide. So why are we talking about California when we're looking at projects in Wisconsin and New York and Texas? And it's really because the value of an LCFS credit has substantially increased. This graph here shows 7 years of LCFS credit values. And you can see over the last 2 to 3 years, credit values have been approaching and around $200 per metric ton. It's the most expensive carbon price in the world. And so anyone that's looking at a renewable fuel project is looking at the California LCFS market to take advantage of these high prices. And you can see there is a $200 price cap on the value of an LCFS credit that is adjusted for inflation. So you can see we've been trading, these credits have been trading at or near the cap price for several years. And it's really, really driven the development of more and more RNG projects, and specifically dairy RNG and on-farm projects. Next slide, please. So why are we talking about dairy manure? This program, both of these programs apply to a lot of different types of RNG, but we had a couple examples to show. If you take RNG from a wastewater treatment plant, it's worth about $45 per MMBTU as just the unit of fuel that you're producing. And next bullet there, for food waste, that's about $16. And finally, if you look at the dairy specific fly-in here on the next one, that same exact volume of RNG is worth $100 per MMBTU in this example. And so there can be 2 to 8x the value of these credits, specifically in the California low carbon fuel standard, but even in the RINs, significantly more value for developing and turning manure into energy and manure into transportation fuel. And it's really that high value. It's the highest value feedstock out there in this market. And there's been a significant increase in project development because of this value. So next slide, please. So, I touched on the carbon intensity score, and that's the reason why these have such a high value in the California LCFS. The better or the lower your carbon intensity score is, and in the case of dairy manure projects and dairy farms, taking that dairy manure and not digesting it in a lagoon, and now capturing that methane that would have been emitted into the atmosphere, and now capturing that into a digester and displacing a fossil-based fuel can have a highly negative carbon intensity score. So you're actually removing carbon out of the atmosphere by doing these projects. And the California program specifically is incentivizing and rewarding those with more and more LCFS credits. And it is providing the economic driver behind doing these projects. And then also in conjunction with the RINs under the federal program, there's a significant value in doing these projects. And just to note, Patrick said a vast majority of the revenues from these projects come from the beneficial reuse of biogas. On that last slide, only about a couple dollars, $2 of that $100 comes from the actual molecules of natural gas. The rest come from these programs that incentivize development of lower carbon fuels. And that's really what we're looking at doing. So if you're looking at comparing that carbon intensity score to, say, a diesel fuel, or even a fossil, compressed natural gas from fossil fuel, you can see all those have a really high, positive 98 to positive 105 carbon intensity score. And your dairy project is a negative score. So huge savings in the carbon emissions that are happening from these projects. Next slide. So what are the benefits to farms to wrap up here? The benefits are revenue sources. Now you're beneficially reusing the biogas you're extracting the energy potential from the manure. So that revenue source is available to a developer, to farmers, and these projects are getting done by using that revenue source. There's environmental benefits. That low carbon intensity score, it's actually net carbon negative. So it's removing carbon from the atmosphere and reducing greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and manure management. The nutrients that are available, these digesters are not doing anything to the nutrients. If anything, they're providing less odor. They're providing those nutrients in maybe a more stable form after going through that digestion and high temperature kind of sterilization of that manure. And so the farmer still gets the manure, they get the environmental benefits, and there's potential significant revenue sources by doing these projects, primarily through those couple of programs that we touched on here. I think next slide, I'll turn that back over to Jamie.
All right, thanks so much, Brad, and really helpful to outline some of the incentives that exist and benefits to farms. Now we're going to shift a little bit to talk to John Larson, who's received some of those benefits, and I think many of you probably on the call have probably met him or come across him at one point or another. John is from J.M. Larson and Larson Dairy, which each represent two farms that came together as the Larson Group to execute an RNG project in Florida. He broke ground over in the last, I think, 6 months or so, maybe back in November 2020. So a lot of this information is really fresh for him and some of the learnings. And when I spoke with him, he talked about it's really helpful. It would have been helpful for me, and he did do some of this to talk to some other farmers up front about what they're experiencing in the space and how some of those initial conversations looked. So we brought him on today. Thank you, John, for sharing your expertise. And I'm just going to ask him a few questions, but I encourage you to type more questions you might have for him in the chat. And again, we'll get to those at the end, or we can follow up with John and get you some answers to those. So first, just wanted to hear from you, John, on how were you first approached by renewable natural gas developer, and was it just one? So kind of what did those initial conversations start to look like? How were you approached, and how did you handle some of that?
Thank you, Jamie, and well, be here today. Being a DMI board member, when Nutrient got started, some of these issues were coming up, and we were hearing about them and whatnot. And it seemed like about a year and a half ago, it's like the light switch just went on. We started getting calls, and we started having a particular person that was in our neighboring county, that was a county commissioner, actually had known the family member, my brother, and linked to the Cattlemen's Association here in Florida. And so we started to listen to him. He says, "Hey, I got something you might be interested in." He says, "I know you have, concentrated dairy farms in Okeechobee area. Would you be interested to sit down and talk to us about a methane project digester?" I said, "Okay, fine." So that was one of the first contacts that we actually had. And then we had several other people either call our state and regional office or our co-op and talked about some of the farms we would like to visit with some of the farms in your areas and so forth. So that's kind of how things got going originally. And as we did the first time meeting, we kind of bid on what they were talking about, some type of revenue stream. And the main thing that kind of caught our ears was they're talking about coming in and doing this project turnkey. We're going to partner with you. We want your manure supply. And so, that's pretty vague to start with, but then you go into more specifics with that. So
that's really helpful. So just to expand on that, did you bring in any outside experts, or who did you start to gather advice from or input from as you worked through some of the questions they were asking? Are there groups that were really helpful for you that you'd like to share with others? Someone that is essential to talk to in this beginning process?
Yes, Jamie. First of all, immediately I'm thinking I'm going to call Nutrient and find out from them. So I got a hold of actually, it was Mark, I think I talked to second time or the first time, but we actually had some people that came into our co-op, and Mr. Rowe, I believe it was, and he came in and talked a little about this broad spectrum that these different companies, there are many of them, are interested in dealing with you guys using some of the carbon credits that are in California. So as we got into that, we needed to know more about what that consisted of. So I immediately got up with Mark Storman, and he brought in a lot of insight to us as to what these things generate and how it's actually paid for. And with certain types of taxes and whatnot in their area, and they're needing to put this money into for development for their credits that they need in that state. So we went with Mark, and he sent us a bunch of spreadsheets, and we started looking at it, and we said, gosh, I mean, it's just so much above what the natural product would be by itself that we thought this thing is for real. And there's a lot of money behind this initiative of some of these companies. At the same time, we started getting calls from other vendors and companies and contractors and interested that they wanted to give their issues and things that they would like to do and whatnot. But for the most part, we kind of analyzed of how we would have a revenue, and we based it upon a per cow basis. And there's several different ways you can do that, but we felt that that was the most easiest way that we needed to see what we could do, because we already had a lot of these NRC and C projects of BMPs that we had put into place, the NRCS. We can't alter a lot of that stuff. You have to understand, in our area, just like in some of your areas are different. In North Florida, they're more considered and concerned about nitrates, where in our area, they're more considered about phosphorus. So as we get into these things, we had to take a look and make sure that it wasn't going to alter the existing plans that we had. So at the farms itself, of course, they're interested in number of cows, and the herds that we have here, the 4 farms that range between 1,500 and 3,000 head. 2 of them are located on the same property, and the other 2 are literally almost on the same property, but they're about 20 miles apart. They started talking about the natural gas aspect, and they had done their homework and found out that we had, which I think is a selling point, or close to your farm would be a selling point. We actually had natural gas lines running through the properties on these 2 locations. So for the big picture, they just started to say, well, we can try to do this. And in the meantime, they're doing their homework, going back and talking to like these different type of gas line operators to see if they'd be interested in certain things. This is a picture actually at Barn 4, and it's a newer freestall operation. And the unique thing about in this total plan was they're going to actually take gas from the digester number 3, and they're going to pipe it 2 miles to this other farm to where the actual underlying pipeline is. And I thought, well, they would be hauling with a truck or whatnot. But no, they're actually going to pipeline it over to this farm to where this injection site is. So that's kind of a new deal. But before, I'm jumping ahead, I guess, a little bit. Before we actually came to terms on these things, there was a lot of questions before we got into some of the specifics that we were concerned about, the plans that are already in place, who would draw the plans. We wanted somebody familiar with the plans. So when we got ready for the letter of intent to take it to that point, that's usually a 90-day period. And then if they need to extend it, we'll give them a little bit more time, but usually inside of 6 months. And that gives you the time to work what I call the heart or core of the whole project, which is the manure supply agreement. And that is where I'm telling every farmer, you need to, number one, have your own engineer to be running your CI scores to see what kind of actually carbon index that you may have there at the farm. And that's where I learned a lot, that a natural landfill may be plus 45, but cow manure may be minus 200. And it's like playing golf. The lower the score wins, you know? So I thought that was kind of interesting. As you get in from one farm to another, it even deviates. The amount of water that's used at that particular operation. So then as we get further in this negotiations, we started looking at, okay, so how much ground are they going to talk about taking up? And how much area as far as the injection site would be taking up? Because that's basically going out of use for your farm. You got to look at that. Can you give up that acreage? It's not a bunch of acres. It's basically about 5 acres on our projects. And the other thing would be that if the smaller injection site, which is taken out maybe an acre at the most, there's going to be 2 of those, one between 2 farms and the other one between 2 farms. The interesting thing about it is they actually have a lease, and they will lease that site acreage. And that's something that you need to be talking about to other farmers to kind of see what you think those revenue streams are, because that's basically on a monthly deal. And the income stream for the gas things, as we got into this deal, that was over a more longer period, like a 6-month period. And usually they like to have operational time before there's actually any revenues back to them and whatnot. So go with another question. I know you had there, Jamie, on something.
Yeah, no, that was really good. And I think you actually covered quite a bit of that. And I know we have questions blinking for you in the chat. So I may just turn it over to Mark to start to talk about how to calculate the cost of manure, like you mentioned. And then at the end, I want to come back. I think it's best to spend time asking participants their questions for you. So if that's okay, I think we'll keep moving on to Mark. And we'll come back with questions at the end. Thanks, John.
Okay, Jamie.
All right. And again, Mark is the Chief Operating Officer of Nutrient, and he's going to walk through some practical next steps that you can take to prepare for these conversations. So he'll show you how to calculate some details of the cost of your manure and also a list of questions that you should be asking, and then we'll get to the Q&A.
Thanks, Jamie, and I want to thank ABC for sponsoring this webinar and helping us put it together. It's an exciting time because it's an opportunity for the dairy industry to have a positive environmental impact, but also to diversify the revenue stream. And so that's one of the reasons that we wanted to kind of get some of this information out for people to understand what they need to consider as they look at digester projects and talk to digester developers. I heard somebody say just recently that when it comes to contracts and things like that, it's the wild, wild west. And that's really true. Everybody and every project is different. And there's opportunities that are abounding. And what you need to do as a producer, as a dairy producer, is really think about your operation and your future as you're getting ready to talk to these people about the digester projects. And think about things that are very practical. For example, digesters generally work better if you're not filling them with sand. And so if you're using sand as a bedding material, you may be asked to switch to manure solids. Is that something that you'd be willing to do? Now, there are digesters that do run on sand bedded dairies, but it requires more revenue, it requires more water. Those are things that you need to consider before you start talking about a digester project. There's going to be a bit more traffic. There will be other people on your property if they're operating equipment on land that you've leased. How are you going to utilize any nutrients that might be brought in if you bring in other substrates? Will there be, and substrates is another word for co-products or other organic materials that the digester could break down. Some projects include them, some don't. Generally, as Brad mentioned, the ones that are going for the low carbon fuel standard are trying to keep the CI score as high as possible So they tend to eliminate the substrates and stay manure only. And then the other thing that John mentioned, I think is really important, is your permitting and what you're currently committed to do, and making sure that you don't change your permit, making sure that you don't run into, issues with your permit by bringing in another project. The other thing you probably need to do, and many of you already have done it, but if you haven't, you need to think about the long term for the dairy and this project. These projects tend to last 15 or 20 years with options to extend them even beyond that. If you're not ready to make a commitment for that amount of time, that's something you're going to have to seriously talk about with the other members of the dairy community, the other members of your family, and the people who are a part of your dairy. What's your succession plan? Who's going to take over? What are they seeing as future opportunities that they may not be able to access if you do a digester project? What kind of expertise do they have? Will they want to be involved in this? And then finally, is this a project that you want a developer to bring all of the investment to, or is this a project you want to invest in? Because that will probably change the dynamics of how the project looks. Next slide, please. One of the things that I always encourage dairymen when we start talking about digester projects is to get with their accountant. And usually that gets with a chuckle because everybody thinks I'm talking about what money they have to invest. But I'm really not. I'm really talking about getting with your accountant and getting all of your costs together related to your dairies. What are you currently paying for permitting, for the collection of the manure, for the transportation of the manure, for your storage, for your spreading? And then how valuable is that manure to you as a fertilizer or as a bedding? And are you getting any credits? Are you getting any sort of, are you willing to take in other products to get tipping fees? These are all things that you need to consider before you have a conversation with someone and before they're asking you to sign up for a feedstock agreement or LOI. And I've worked up a couple of models. Go to the next slide, please, Jimmy. Both of them are based on a 350 cow dairy. I'm not saying that that's a dairy that right now is perfectly cost effective for an RNG project. You'd probably need to put several 350 cow dairies together. But a 350 cow dairy in some areas of the country where they have a renewable electricity standard might actually be able to meet return on investment thresholds that may interest developers. As more opportunities for markets occur, we might see smaller and smaller farms be able to afford these projects. But just real quickly running you through what John mentioned, he did his by his cost per cow. Another way to look at it is by cost of per hundredweight. So I looked at what would you have a 350 cow dairy that's doing a daily spread operation. And so we just worked up their, 4.7 million gallons a year and said, takes about an hour a load. And, somebody's either going to get paid to haul that load or, you're not going to be working somewhere else. So we put a dollar figure to that. We looked at the total dollars per hour to operate the vehicle. You can't see it on some of the slides, but that number is actually a rolled up dollar from the University of Arkansas's machine operating equipment website. So that's a tanker. That's the cost for the tractor. I think it was a 250 horsepower cab covered tractor operating for the hours that we had per load. So that worked up to the $78. There's also a vacuum tanker that most people are going to pull out of a pit and use for distribution. So we added that in there, just did a straight line annual cost for that. And then we divided that both by the number of cows. So you got a cost per cow per year and by a number of hundredweights, just so that you have an idea going in. And let's go into the next slide real quickly, just to show an example of how that can change if you, for example, went scrape to a lagoon, or if you were flushing to a lagoon. Same number of cows, same number of gallons, but now you're moving stuff out through pivots, you're moving stuff out potentially with a custom applicator, and you're seeing a little different score. And this is where you need to know what your numbers are to be able to have a good conversation with a developer as they're coming in, because you really want to look at the whole picture and understand that these projects do require capital commitment and they do require a lot from the developer, but they also are putting a very expensive project next to your very expensive project, your dairy. And so you want to find a way that down the road, you can both be happy with this project and that everyone will get a fair return. Let's go to the next slide, Jimmy. So one of the things I suggest, and this is a list of some of the questions that you could ask a developer when they come to you. I'm going to do this kind of quickly, just touch on some of the points because I want to leave enough time. We have quite a few questions. But you may ask them how many dairy projects they have and how many are operating. And I don't want to say that everybody has to have, you know, dozens of projects. You know, everybody has a first project, but it does give you an opportunity to see where they're coming from, what their experience is. And then if they have operating projects, I would suggest you ask to talk to some of their dairy partners. You know, find out what their experience is with people in the dairy community that they're working with right now. John mentioned a 90-day, you know, due diligence period on a project, you know, signing a letter of intent or signing a manure agreement. I think that's a really smart number to keep in mind. I have seen developers that have come and asked for very, very long commitments because they really didn't have capital lined up. They really didn't have a project ready to go. And so they were trying to tie up a lot of manure contracts in an area to be able to start finding financing and things like that. And if that's going to be the case, you should know that. But I would generally say that you should always make sure that you understand what the length of any agreement you sign. And also, in addition, make sure that there is a termination of each agreement that you sign. So if something does go wrong with a project, you have a date that you say you can start looking at other opportunities. Then asking them what they're expecting for the length of their project, what kind of term are they looking for? Is it 10, 15, 20 years? That can be significant depending on how you approach the project and how you approach the other people on your dairy and whether they're willing to do it. Something I think that people don't often think about are the next two questions. Number one is if there's a significant upside that happens in the RNG market, how will the project share that with the dairy? Or are you going to be locked into the same thing? And for example, you know, if the prices go from that $100 per MMBTU that Brad showed you to $200, is that all going to the developer or is that going to be shared with the dairy? But then at the same time, in that spirit of treating everyone fair, I think you need to ask what's going to happen, or what is the developer going to expect if there's a significant downturn, and what is their expectation going to be from the dairy if suddenly the value of the RNG drops. And those are good discussions to have before you've committed and signed contracts. And then I think it's always important when you're talking to a developer to have a conversation of termination clauses in a contract. You know, everybody has to have a way out. And that always feels a little uncomfortable when you're excited about doing a project. But in the long run, knowing that that's there, if suddenly there isn't a way to get along 5 years down the road, and having spelled that out before emotions get involved can be very, very important. So I would say you always want to have a conversation around any termination clauses that would be in the agreements. Finally, what's going to happen and who gets to develop the future manure-related revenue? So for example, if environmental credits come in, do the developers get the opportunity to harvest those environmental credits, or does the dairy share in that? Or does the dairy get all of the digestate back? And whatever happens to the digestate after the RNG is unrelated to the RNG project. Having those sort of discussions up front can be very, very helpful. And then finally, I think it's important, whether you are interested in participating as an investor or not, that you find out what is the source of capital for the project. And if you were interested, could you participate? That'll tell you a little bit about the company that you're working with and the company that's approaching you. Again, like I said, it is the Wild West in some respects, but at the same time, you need to do your due diligence and have some understanding of what you're getting into. So I want to stop now and see if we can get to as many of the questions as we can. Jamie, I think maybe if you would kind of lead out with that.
Yeah, so we have quite a few questions. Again, we'll get to as many of them as we can. If not, we will type up responses and get it to everyone who attended. I'll go ahead and kick off with the first question for John. As we think about working with some of the vendors, as we think about, all the years that have gone by since this became a big thing and more common, maybe the benefits to farms were not as seen before. These companies have vastly more experience in energy markets than the average farmer does. Do you find that the developers are more respectful of farmers today and show a willingness to fund the project, operate the project, share with a reasonable percentage of the revenue stream so that it's worthwhile for the farm to provide a consistent manure supply? So have these conversations, I guess, gotten a little bit more flexible, and are you able to best represent your farm in some of these conversations today? Don't know.
John, you're on mute.
Okay, there you go. Yes, absolutely. One of the things I meant to touch on, and Mark did a great job with some of these other questions that we dealt with, because I called him on a lot of expertise of questions that I wanted to ask these people. But when it got down to really dealing with this manure supply agreement, best advice is get you a very good environmental attorney to not be subjective or tie yourself up to something that you can't actually do. I think they were very open about that, and even actually had a budget to pay for the environmental attorney. So I think that's very important for any farmer that's looking at going into these things. But far as sharing what may the future bring hold, understanding that acts of God can happen, downturn in the dairy business can happen. The term that Mark referred to also, when you're talking with these vendors, the term is a big thing. And some of us that don't have maybe younger generations coming on and whatnot, you really have to dig in there to find out if you're willing to be in this thing for 15 or up to 20 years. That's an area that they would love to go as long as they could. But that's where I think you have to dig in to figure out what is practical for your family operation.
That's great. Thanks, John. Another question, and this one probably for Brad. What happens to high value RINs when food waste is a co-substrate?
Yeah, not to get too deep, but RNG, biogas and RNG can qualify for two different kinds of RINs, a D5, which is a non-cellulosic based RIN, and a D3, which is a cellulosic based feedstock RIN. So the dairy manure qualifies for D3. The food waste or any non-cellulose material qualifies for D5. When you co-digest those, you're going to devalue all the gas down to that D5 level. And the RIN difference, so just as an example, a current D3 RIN is $3 per gallon equivalent, and a D5 RIN is worth about $1.30 gallon equivalent. So that's a difference. That's a significant value difference between those two. So like Mark said, you just need to do the economic analysis. Does it make sense? The food waste or the substrate may make more gas, but it may produce less of an overall revenue source. So it's an individual analysis that needs to be done on a project by project basis.
Jamie, could I just add in?
Yeah.
So, and to add into that, you also need to take into account whether you're getting paid to take that food waste. You might be getting a lot of revenue coming in from a tipping fee that would go into that calculation. And if your system happens to be big enough that you have more than one digester tank, you might actually be able to have your cake and eat it too. You might be able to keep your manure separate and retain the higher value RINs and take in food waste, which is currently a lower value, about a half the value. You might be able to do both. So there's some details there to look into.
That's great. Thanks for adding. A couple of questions about the minimum size for viable ROI. I think, Mark, you may have touched on this. You demonstrated a 350 head example. Can you just provide what you believe the minimum for a viable ROI might be for this program?
Yeah, I would say probably right now, from what I've heard from the developers I've talked to, you probably need to be approaching 10,000 cows in a region to justify an interconnect, because the interconnection costs are very high. Now, usually that's going to take more than one dairy. So how you combine the dairies, how many head you have, how much other gas production you can get, they're really trying to cluster around these injection points with those type of numbers. But the individual dairy size might be significantly smaller. And we know of small dairies, for example, in Vermont, of less than 350 cows that are operating generators under their cow power program and that actually get a reasonable ROI. So it really is dependent on what programs you're going into and what part of the country that you are in and what revenues are available.
Great. And I think we have time for a couple more. There were a couple of questions about, is there any nutrient recovery involved, or are we simply just recovering RNG on these projects? Maybe Mark or...
Well, that kind of depends on the project. Like I said, it's the Wild West. I think there are some other, questions about what if they have to change something on the dairy? Well, you start with a blank sheet of paper and, people who are trying to agree on how is going to be the best to run this long-term relationship and working out who's going to be responsible for taking care of the nutrients. In some areas, the farm may be fine with just spreading the digestate. And the ABC has a digestate certification program. And in some areas, using that digestate as a fertilizer is fine. In other areas where there are more sensitivities to nitrates or more sensitivities to phosphorus, there are technologies that can take those out. Who's going to pay for those? Who's going to operate those? Where the revenue comes from to cover those is all part of what you're going to have to negotiate as you look at a project.
Great. One more question for John that came through. Can you talk about how you got buy-in from residents or the community for this project?
Very good question. Yes, that was the real exciting thing in far as the community and the governor's office said, this is right where we want to go. Now, we are actually on the very north end of the Lake Okeechobee, which goes, the waters go to the Everglades. Everglades are a really big environmental thing. And so U.S. Sugar Company is down to the south of us. We have a lot of dairy farms in the north end of the lake. So it's an environmental sensitive kind of area that we've been under the gun anyway since 1989 when they came out with a DER rule. Well, when this thing came in, this was a real big game changer for as a lot of the legislators, our county commissioners completely, they negotiated, right, Mark, Energy got with our county commissioners, actually worked into some on the taxing side of things, got it got an incentive there. The state legislators got involved. We're very pleased on this. So this just worked right all the way up to the governor's department. We had several people involved helping, to get the go ahead with this thing. They were very pleased. They thought this was the right direction for agriculture.
That's great. Thanks for sharing your experience. And I think we have just a minute left, so I wanted to wrap up with a few things. We don't want you to miss our upcoming webinars. There will be more information coming out about our future topics, including solar. We're going to do webinars on both carbon and water quality programs that exist today, energy audits, some emerging and existing technologies that we've evaluated and plan to over the next year, and then a big topic, feed additives and manure additives. So looking forward to doing more of these. A big thank you to all the speakers who shared their knowledge today. We will send a recording out to all of those who tuned in. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at Nutrient. You can call the number listed, or my email is listed right there, and we'll get back to you. We will also try to get back to all your questions, and thank you for providing those in the chat today. Have a great day, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.